Okay, so continuing on with the emergence of the plantation complex in the New World. As I said in the previous video, it was the Dutch West India Company designed explicitly to transport slaves to the New World from West Africa. But what is significant, it wasn't just to other Dutch colonies. The Dutch supplied slaves to all of the European powers, whether it be the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. The British, again, come later by chartering a company called the Royal Africa Company. It's the same kind of remit as the Dutch company. It exists solely to trade in slaves. Now, whenever African slaves replaced indentured servants, it became very important. Historian Robert Blackburn called slaves the sort of shock troops of global capitalism. It was vital to the takeoff in production and the creation of sort of staple crop commodities that would become essential in the Industrial Revolution that was taking place in Britain and a little bit later in the American Northeast. Slaves were far more important, as we'll see, and you can see on the slide here, in Portugal's colonies rather than the Spanish. In fact, in Brazil, they accounted for 50% of the population as opposed to 2% of the population in the Spanish Empire. Now, if we look at the dynamics of the slave trade, a conservative, and this is a very conservative estimate, places the amount of slaves forcibly taken against their will from West Africa between 1500 and 1850 at about 10.5 million people. Now, that's a conservative estimate. Recently, historians have looked over the data and revised that figure to be as high as 13 or 14 million people. Now, if we look at the numbers here, it's a sort of striking pattern, because I think when most of us think of slavery, at least those of us that live in North America, we tend to think of the American South, right? We tend to think of the American South. It leads to the American Civil War, and slavery ends under Lincoln and all that. But in reality, the vast majority of slaves that had to make this sort of horrendous passage across the Atlantic, something that was known as the Middle Passage, went to Brazil. As we can see here, 5 million went to Brazil. A further 3 million went to the British West Indies. 2 million went to the Dutch and Spanish Caribbean. About 300,000 went to British North America. And the total trade post-1776 to the United States was 200,000. So what we see here, in terms of these staggering numbers, the smallest amount actually end up in what becomes the southern United States, which is striking because by 1860, the southern United States is the largest and most advanced slave society in the world, and arguably the sort of largest slave society that had ever existed. The entire economy of the American South was based on slavery. It took a very different trajectory from the northern economy, which your readings highlight. Now, how do we account for these numbers? Why is it that you end up with millions and millions of people in Brazil and the Caribbean, the British, the Dutch, and the Spanish Caribbean, but so much less, at least initially, in what becomes the United States, although by 1860 there were more slaves in the southern United States than almost anywhere else in the world? Now, part of what accounts for this is what slaves were brought to do. If we look at the Caribbean and Brazil, most slaves, at least initially, were going to work on sugar plantations. Now, sugar plantations were probably the most horrendous and awful and terrible conditions that existed in plantation slavery. When you combine that with a tropical climate, with disease, we see that sugar slavery was basically a death trap. Those plantations had a kind of insatiable demand for slaves. Fertility rates were also low. So if you were lucky enough, using the term loosely here, to make it across and survive the Middle Passage, and about 12% did not survive the Middle Passage, and we'll look in the next video, or maybe this one, at how horrendous that passage actually was, it was very likely you were going to die in sugar production. It was the harshest form of slavery in the New World. And also, as I said, fertility rates were very low. So you had a much larger percentage of slaves dying in the Caribbean and Brazil, and very few actually being born. So they didn't grow through natural increase. They had to constantly be replaced, which is why you ended up with millions and millions there. They basically, a large percentage of them were just led to their deaths at this point. Now, in the United States, or what becomes the United States, even though only about 300,000 slaves exist, they will grow to 5 million by 1865. And this was because mortality rates were far lower, owing to the fact that sugar wasn't really cultivated in the United States. As we looked at in the previous slide, what was happening initially was tobacco, and then rice and indigo, and then by the 19th century, of course, King Cotton emerges, and the United States sort of takes off economically as a result of that. And fertility rates were high. So through natural increase in the United States, or what becomes the United States, they go from having the smallest slave population in the New World to the largest slave population by 1860. And we can see here in the next slide specifically where slavery takes hold in the Americas. And this is sort of a snapshot of the 18th century, so the 1700s. We see tobacco up here, Virginia and Maryland. In North Carolina and South Carolina, we get rice. In Georgia as well, we get rice and also indigo. And then when you get into the Caribbean, it's almost all sugar. This here, Saint-Domingue, which eventually becomes Haiti, which we'll talk about more in the liberal democratic revolutions, when you get the Haitian Revolution, the first and only successful slave rebellion in the history of American slavery. It was one of the wealthiest colonies in the world. In fact, Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, was so wealthy that when the British defeated the French in the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British gave the French a choice. You can keep Saint-Domingue or you can keep Quebec. They chose to keep Saint-Domingue because Quebec at that time was, in comparison, worthless when compared with the wealth of sugar that was being extracted in Saint-Domingue. You also see sugar plantations in what is now the Bahamas, on the northern edge of South America. You also have pockets of slave plantations. This was called New Granada. You also see it in Venezuela. And you start to see coffee and production here in Bahia, in Brazil. And then further to the south in Rio de Janeiro, you also get sugar production.